Welcome to the Grit. Today we're going to be making a box, a little organizer to hold all of my filming stuff in my laptop. That way I can carry it wherever I need to go. The wood we're going to be using is just some stuff we had left over from another project that never got used. So when you're choosing your boards to build something, you want to make sure you look at it and see whether it's straight or not. As you can see, this first one is real crooked, and that's not really what we're looking for, so we're going to set that one off to the side, and we're going to end up using the board on the bottom here because it's a lot straighter and it'll be a lot easier to get the warp out of it when we go to plane it in the next step. So I'm just going to rough cut these boards to start out with. You could technically run these through the planer without cutting them down first. I could just run the whole board through the planer, but I don't really have the space to do that, and I think it's a little easier to get all the warp out whenever you cut them down. It just seems like it takes it out a little bit faster. So I'm just cutting these off with a circular saw here, and I'm making them longer than what they actually need to be. We're not doing real accurate marks right now. And I'll explain that a little bit later on in the video, why I cut them longer than what they actually need to be. Now we're using 2x8s. They're about a 7 1/8 inches wide to start out with, and they're about 1.5 inches thick. So we're going to plane them down here to get two really nice flat sides. Now when you buy lumber like this from the store or from a lumber yard, if it's made to go in a house or a building, they're already going to have pretty nice faces on them. But because this wood has set for a while, it has dried out some more. It's probably set for at least 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. It started to warp some, and I really don't like the finish that's on it right now. That's why we actually didn't use the boards, because they didn't do it the correct way. And they're a little bit too thick for what we're doing. So that's really why I'm planing them down here, is just to get them nice and cleaned up on both sides. Whenever you're planing these boards, you just take off a little bit on each side and you flip it over and take a little bit off on the other side, and just keep working back and forth. That way you get them as flat as you possibly can. We're going to end up taking these boards down to about 1 1/8 inches in thickness. So we end up taking off about 3/8 of an inch total in thickness. There you can see they're all nice and flat. There's no gaps. So the next step here is to square up the edges. Now, like I said before, they come from wherever you buy them usually. If they're finished boards, they'll have smooth faces, and they're probably going to have some kind of beveled edge. So they're going to have rounded corners. And I don't want that right away, because I want to be able to have everything nice and flat and square when I go to actually make the box. So I'm squaring up both of the edges right now, And I'm taking some of the height off the boards in doing that, so the box isn't quite as tall. Now this is why I cut them a little bit longer. You can see there's a little bit of tear out here where there's a knot that goes through the board. And that's not a big deal because we'll just end up cutting that off later. So after I get the sides nice and square and cut, now we're going to go ahead and square up one of the ends before we go to cut the boards to length. Now if you cut these on the table saw to begin with and you cut them to the length you needed, you wouldn't have to do this step, you could skip it. But because I rough cut them with the circular saw, I want to make sure that I have a square end that's nice and true that I can measure from to get the length of the board. That way our box will fit together really nicely. Now whenever you go to stack these up, make sure you keep all the square ends on the right side, because if you mix them up, you're not really doing yourself any good by cutting them in the first place. So we're going to go ahead and cut these shorter boards to about 11 inches because the inside of the box is going to be exactly 11 inches. The dimensions of this box are based on the size of the laptop that I have, because I use it whenever I'm filming. So we basically just built the box around the laptop and then added in all the rest of the filming equipment in the bottom. Now these longer boards, you have to add 1 1/8 to each side whenever you're measuring this. I want the inside of the box to be 16 inches total. So these boards are going to be cut at 18 1/4 to account for going around the short boards. And one thing to keep in mind whenever you're cutting something, whether it's wood or metal or anything else, whenever you're marking and cutting, is pay attention to where you're actually cutting at. A lot of people, they just mark the line and then they just cut right in the center of the line. Well, that's not an accurate cut. So what I'm doing here is I marked it, that way I can put the inside edge of the saw blade on the inside edge of the line. So I'm just basically removing the line as I'm cutting the board. Because if your saw blade is wider than your pencil mark and you go to cut a piece of wood, you're going to cut it too short. You can see I got everything cut nice and squared up. Looks good. We're going to be using just regular galvanized deck screws that I had laying around. The drill bit, if you're drilling a hole, if you're pre-drilling, you want the drill bit to be about the size of the core of the screw, maybe just a little bit larger. If it's too small, or if you don't pre-drill at all, you run the risk of actually cracking the wood and splitting it out. Now with something like this being pine, it's not 100% necessary because it's such a soft wood. It's kind of forgiving, but I like to pre-drill everything when I'm making something like this just so I don't risk ruining all the work that I just did. Now I've got everything laid out on the table here. I'm putting the short pieces on the inside. And that's why we measure the long pieces a little bit longer. As you see, they wrap around the short pieces here. Got the speed square on the inside of the box to keep the corner square, and we're just going to do one corner at a time. Pre-drill the holes and then put the screws in and work our way around, adjusting and getting everything nice and square as we go. It helps if you have a nice flat surface to build something like this on. I'm building it on one of my welding tables. Actually, I wouldn't really consider this a welding table. It's more of a workbench with a metal top, but I still use it for welding anyways. But anyways, if you have a nice flat surface, it really helps. Now, if you look closely, you can see that I'm not actually putting the screws all the way in just yet. I'm going to leave a little bit of the screw head sticking out, maybe a quarter of an inch or so. That way I still have some wiggle room as we work our way around the box here. I can move pieces, I can twist and push, and I still have just a little tiny bit of play to get every single corner of the box square first, and then we'll go back through and tighten up all the screws at the end, once we have everything nice and square where we actually want it to go. This is a very critical step. Whenever you're making something, you want to take your time to make sure you get it lined up, because if you try to rush through this process, you're just going to cause yourself more headache later on in the project. So just take your time and take it easy and make sure everything's nice and straight, nice and true where you actually want it to be. And then the rest of it will go together smoothly. As you can see, I'm using both my drill and my impact here. It really helps if you have multiple tools that you can set up at the same time. Then I can just drill the hole with one, throw the screw in with the other. I don't have to constantly be taking the drill bit out and messing around with the bit for the screws and switching back and forth. Now, whenever I went to set these boards up on the table, one thing I forgot to mention was you want to look over your boards. So look over both sides of your boards, look over the edges, and you get to decide where you want to put stuff when you make something like this. Whether it's furniture or a shelf or whatever. Think about which side is going to be seen the most and which edge and which face people are going to be looking at, what you're actually going to be looking at, and pick the best side that you want to see. So I put the inside faces on the inside because maybe they were less quality, maybe they have extra knots that I don't want to see. Maybe I'm going to put a fastener or a hole in a certain place and I don't want a knot in the way. You know, that's just something to think about when you're building something out of wood like this, especially out of pine, because it's full of knots and the grain goes all different directions. So it's not the same as building out of a nice straight grain hardwood. But either way, it's a good idea to just look at all the different faces. You pick your favorite one to put front and center, the one that you're going to display. Put the nicer board on the front of the box. Put the one that doesn't look as good on the back. Put the crappier faces towards the inside. Now these deck screws are 2.5 inches long, and they're a Phillips head screw. I'm not really a huge fan of Phillips head screws. I like square bits more and the star headed screws. If you get a square head or a star bit or whatever, you're going to get a lot more torque out of it without having to worry about it slipping off and stripping out. So that's something to think about whenever you go to buy hardware. Of course, I didn't buy these. They were just sitting on the shelf, something that we had left over. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to be using in this video is just pieces that were left over, or some of the metal that I use later on is just scrap pieces that were drops. Since this is a welding shop, so got a lot of metal scraps laying around. Now that I've got all the sides put together and everything nice and square, I'm going to go back with the drill actually and tighten up all the screws all the way. I'm going to sink them down in so they're flush. Now we're going to be using a 1/2 inch piece of plywood for the bottom of this box. It's about the easiest thing you can get to cut to put on the bottom. You're never really going to see the bottom, so it doesn't have to be nice, pretty wood. Piece of plywood will do just fine. We're going to measure it with the big square and then just cut it out with the circular saw here. Now the lid is actually going to be made out of the same thing as the sides. And I forgot to mention, but those boards were included earlier when we cut and planed everything. And those were exactly the same as the boards I used on the sides as far as dimensions go. If you look very closely, you can see that the plywood has a little bit of warp to it. So we're going to put the warp, the pointy side facing up, if that's what you want to call it. That way, whenever we get all the screws in there, we can pull it down nice and flat. Putting some extra screws in here just so that it all stays nice and flat on the bottom of the box, and I don't end up having a curved bottom, so the box actually sits flat on the table. Since we did all that work to make the sides flat, and there we got the bottom on there. Looks nice so far. So I've got some 2x4 here that we're going to cut up and make some little dividers on the inside. The reason I'm using a 2x4 instead of a 1x, normally I would use a 1x to make dividers because they don't need to be thick. It's not the same as the structure of the box on the outside being a 2x, but I'm using a 2x4 in this instance because I want the laptop to sit on top of the divider almost like a shelf, rather than trying to put the laptop down in the bottom of the box and sitting everything on top of it and having weight on top of it and stuff like that. I'd rather be able to access it from the top. That way everything can have its own little spot to sit down in there, and then we'll just sit the laptop on top of everything. Now, I don't have a whole lot of screws left here, so I just grabbed an old can of nails, and we're going to go ahead and put these dividers together here. The easiest way to do something like this is just to stand it up on end and just make sure it's square. If you're wondering what size of nails I'm using, I really don't even know. I mean, they're probably as old as I am, so who knows what they actually are. They've been in that old can for decades, so now whenever I measured this insert piece, what I tried to do was leave like maybe a 2-inch gap or about that around the whole outside. That way I can run my charging cords and stuff around the outside. It's actually going to rest right up against the front of the box here. And then I can run the cords around the sides and the back and put like the camera and the microphone and the batteries and chargers and everything will be in the middle, so it won't shake around and move. So what I did was I set it in there where I wanted it. I measured it, got it centered up, and then I just lightly traced some pencil lines around where the boards are actually at. That way I can just go in here on the inside of the box and I can drill my holes where I want my screws to go, and I don't have to try to guess where I'm putting my screws. So I've got some scrap pieces here. Everything we're using in this video is going to be 304 stainless steel. I don't want to have to paint anything. I don't want to worry about it rusting. I think stainless steel looks a lot better. It's more fun to build stuff like this with stainless steel. So the tubing is a 7/8 inch outside diameter, and it's got an 1/8 inch wall. It's DOM, so that's nice to work with. The flat bar that you see here is 1 inch by 1/4 inch. Now I'm going through, I'm cleaning everything up after I cut it. I'm using a 120 grit flap wheel here. Now this flap wheel is dedicated for stainless steel use only. You'll hear me talk about that later when we get to the wire brushing part. If you're doing anything with stainless steel, don't use tools that you used on carbon steel. Otherwise, you can get little deposits in there and it'll actually make your stainless steel rust. And if you go to weld it, you can get little pockets, you can get little pieces of deposits inside your weld, and it can cause porosity. It can cause problems if you use carbon steel stuff on your stainless steel when you're working with it. So as we move over to the bench grinder here, I'm just trying to take off as much material as I can, as fast as I can. We're using the 30 grit wheel here. I'm rounding off all the edges that are not going to be welded to give them a nice clean look. Basically just radiusing the end to be about the same radius as the metal itself. And then once I get everything roughed off with the bench grinder there, I'm going to bring it back over to the table here and take the 120 grit to it again. And just kind of try to clean stuff up a little bit. Take the roughness out of it. Make it nice and smooth. Make it look good. Now these longer pieces I cut are going to be for the handle. I'm making a carry handle for this box. All the pieces you saw me cut previously in sand, those are for the hinges. So the longer pieces are going to go on the lid. We're going to drill some holes and they're going to hold the pieces of the lid together. And then the shorter pieces are going to get welded together and bolted onto the back of the box with the tubing acting as the hinge. We're going to put a bolt through the tubing and that's going to be our hinge. Doing the same thing with these pieces that I'm making the handles out of, just radiusing the ends off. I think it gives it a nice clean look and it takes the sharp edge off while also giving it a little bit of style points at the same time. I don't have any footage of the welding because I don't have a lens for my camera yet. But as you can see, this is the hinges after they have been welded. I'm just going through and marking these holes here. All the radius ends are marked about 3/4 of an inch away from the end. And the other holes are going to be about 2 inches away from the hinge itself. That way we don't get too close to the edge of the box and have any sort of issues with the wood wanting to tear out. Starting out with a small bit just to get a nice accurate hole. If you're drilling stainless steel, or if you're drilling anything, you really want to center punch it, but especially important with stainless steel. You absolutely cannot drill stainless steel without a center punch. Really, really important thing to remember. Or it's a hard enough material that your bit's just going to walk all over the place and you're never going to get anywhere close to where you made your mark. So keep that in mind. Now as you can see, we're drilling the final hole here. We're using a 5/16 stainless steel hardware for everything. So I'm drilling the hole just a little bit bigger than that, just one size bigger of what I had in my drill bits case. That way we have a little bit of play and we can move the hinge and get it to sit exactly where we want it later on. So now that I have my holes drilled, I'm going back, I'm knocking off all the burrs, and I'm going over the entire piece with that 120 grit flat disc. That way I can just get everything smoothed out, clean up the edges, clean up the ends, make sure the hinge is going to function properly. Get everything nice and smooth. Make it look good. You know, if you're going to put the time into something, do it all the way and just make it nice. And we're going to move over to the wire wheel now. I like the way a brushed finish looks on 304 stainless. Now, if we had a higher quality stainless, or if we were making like a toolbox or a bumper or something, you might want to polish this out. But I like the brushed look. It's a lot quicker. It's a lot easier. You just take the wire brush and you go over everything, make sure it's nice and smooth. You don't have any gouges. It just gives it a nice smooth finish, and it still is a little bit shiny. Now this is a stainless steel brush, and it is also dedicated for stainless steel only. This is where we're going to leave the video off. Come back for part 2. Thanks for watching.